Hey guys, welcome to Cydonia Hills Part 7, which is quite an interesting video actually, I think, since I got more work done than I expected beforehand, so there's quite a bit of stuff in this episode, which is also a little bit of a problem, since I'm not really sure what I'm gonna have to do in the next episode. It will either become extremely short or extremely long and messy, so we'll see about that, but that's something to worry about in the future. But in this video I'll lay down most of what is going to be the core of the theming of the Japanese area. Lots of buildings, lots of pathwork, lots of foliage and gardening and all sorts of decorations. So yeah, that's what I want to get into here. Now the basic build-up of the Japanese area almost sort of mirrors the build-up of the Alpine area. It has this sort of very large winding plaza-like path in the middle of it, where I wanted to place all of the biggest buildings and attractions on the side of it, so also wanted to add this quick slide over here, and on the side of that as well I wanted to add all sorts of buildings, which is what most of this area is gonna be made out of, and what most of this video is also gonna be made out of. So I just wanted to quickly lay down those paths so I had kind of an idea of where and how I wanted to build the buildings, and know for sure that they would kind of work out, which is a pretty nice way to plan buildings out, though in hindsight I probably should have just used ground paint instead of paths, because guests started walking in places where I didn't really want them. But yeah, it's the planning worked out in the end. So what I wanted to do here with the buildings is make some Japanese townhouses. I think the correct Japanese name for it is a machiya, but somewhere some Japanese person probably wants to kill me now for that pronunciation, so I'll just call them Japanese townhouses from now on. But they're the thing that I wanted to get into this area mostly and make most of the scenery out of. They're not the most, they're not like the first thing that most people think about when you think of Japanese architecture. They're not really the most representative thing in that sense. Like, you'd be more inclined to think of big temple buildings and pagodas and things like that. But if you're going into the more classical side of Japan that's still left, they are what you're going to see most around cities and villages, and that's why I wanted to use these townhouses to get most of the buildings in here. And I was a little bit worried about this at first, because I wasn't really sure how to exactly tackle these buildings. What makes them kind of tough to work with is that they're very narrow houses. They're not that big. They're much like other townhouses in the world, in the sense that they're often very narrow, because taxes used to be paid by how much of the street you're occupying. So a narrow house just means that you need to pay less tax, and in that sense they became sort of very narrow houses with a small front, with a small roof sticking out and a few decorations on the front, but not that much. And most of what makes them so distinctly Japanese is that typical Japanese townhouse build-up, and also the details that you have in there. But the details are obviously something that are hard to get into in Parkitect. So there was a lot of shuffling with these roofs to actually make sure that they kind of look like some Japanese townhouses. Basic build-up is just simple gable roof on the top, with one roof on the front sticking out. And as for the backs of these buildings, I wasn't really too worried about that. You would see them in real life being longer than these buildings are, but for the sake of this being a theme park and not really having any more space, the front and how these buildings connect to the paths is what I was most concerned with, and what most of my attention was going to. And yeah, there's basically shuffling with the roofs, in a sense that I had to use the simple gable roofs that the game gives you to get the basic roof shape in. The flat roof sides actually work quite nicely to not only make the roofs hang over the grid a little bit, but also give them that very distinctly Japanese sort of curve into the roof, which townhouses don't actually usually have, but it does help to sort of give this entire area a bit of a Japanese theme park vibe. So I'm quite happy with that as well. And some of the details include just make pretend windows in all of the buildings by just putting some pillars together. It is kind of a shame that the base game doesn't have any windows that aren't actually transparent yet, because windows that you can just plop over an existing wall, even though they aren't technically windows, are quite nice and easy to use for games like this. But yeah, since there is a lack of them at the moment, I just figured it would be nice to use pillars instead, which do kind of have that Japanese paper screen window look to them, so that worked out quite nicely. And for all of the buildings, I'm just putting some random details together to make something that looks like a door pretty much, which is never actually a door and often just made out of gravestones or pipes, but I'm quite happy with how those turn out as well. So as you can notice at this point probably, is that most of these buildings do follow this same blueprint template idea of what a townhouse looks like. It's just one big part that sticks out and the lower roof that connects it to the path, which overhangs a bit, maybe has some posts that support it just over the path as well, though I did want to watch out with that a little bit because I don't want to go right into the middle of the paths, because then obviously you'll end up with people walking straight through posts and things like that. And yeah, that's a little bit problematic, so I didn't want to avoid that. Now in the middle of this here, I just had a bit of foliage, and the reason that I want to fill in all of these areas quite densely is not just because this is, in the end, a park in a sort of foresty setting. I wouldn't normally say that you should fill up every single part of the park with just trees. It can actually be really nice to have some open areas as well. But in this case I also really needed it to give a bit of a transition between these areas, because the Japanese area is quite close to the other areas in the park. And the only thing that really divides them could be the foliage, because there isn't any kind of gates or anything that really, you know, puts up a wall between these areas and makes sure that you don't see the other area from another area, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I wanted to use my foliage as a bit of a smokescreen to prevent being able to look at the other areas while you're in the alpine area or something like that. And I wanted to sprinkle a few colored trees on top just to give it that slight Japanese look without adding any ridiculous foliage or cherry trees, because that's sadly impossible. And ended up with some grass on the bottom again, just to give it that extra ground foliage detail, which is probably gonna be very bad for the performance of this park. Though then again, it might also be used for performance testing. I don't know, it's probably a pretty good thing to add grass to this anyway. I do always like to cluster it around in like small clusters to kind of give you the idea that there's a lot of grass on the ground, instead of just leaving them all very sparse and with just about the same distance from each other, which just doesn't give as much of a dense look with the same amount of grass sprites. And I just kind of like clustering ground foliage quite a bit. It is a bit of a Japanese thing as well, but Japanese gardening is something which I'll hardly get into, and I'll only do so a little bit in the next episode. I won't really go into any foliage magic in this episode quite yet. Now I still had a little bit of space left over here, and it isn't quite enough to actually get a proper townhouse in, especially with the monorail and the coaster and the pagoda on all sides. It is quite a very crammed space, but it's one little dead end corner where I didn't really want to keep it empty because it is quite central to this area, so I wanted to just add a very small stall to it, almost in a Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 kind of stall idea, except it's 2 tiles instead of 1, and I think that's a stall which serves hot chocolate, so I may want to look at that because that's not the most theme related thing. It's kind of weird to have a hot chocolate store in a Japanese section of a park. No matter how popular hot chocolate might be in Japan, I'm not sure about that. But yeah, that's just a quick little store to give it some sort of building and give you some sort of thing which you can actually do on that plaza, because if I actually want to keep people on that central plaza and actually have something to attract guests, I better actually have some functional stalls. Just a nice way to add some extra atmosphere to the plaza. Now, skipping this boring bit of doing foliage here, I'm back to making some buildings, which are again going to be very similar to the buildings which I've built before in this episode, just with a little bit more practice, so a little bit quicker I suppose, and maybe a bit better too, though you be the judge about that. They are mostly just similar and following the same general formula that I followed earlier on. The only thing that I could really say to keep in mind about this though is that I definitely filled up some spaces on these buildings, which in hindsight I didn't have to because they are connected buildings, so these windows and pillars on the side and everything there isn't really exactly necessary. In real life these buildings wouldn't always be like right next to each other, like just a very small space between them. But obviously this game just works on one full grid for walls, so they had to be right next to each other, which there were a couple of compromises which I wanted to make for that as well, because just to make it look like they are almost like 1/2 a meter away from each other. Wanted to give them slightly different heights on the roofs to make sure that the roofs don't directly connect, which does help quite a bit to at least give them a very slight sort of offset look to them, even though they are exactly in the same grid and exactly in the same placement. So the first house is pretty much finished, and it's quite a simple house, nearly exactly the same to the ones that I've made before. Now for this building I wanted to experiment a bit, not going completely wild with it, but it's a bit taller, and it actually has some pretty full shoji screens, which I am not sure if they're actually in the right placements, but they're basically the sliding paper walls that you see around Japanese buildings, instead of just the very small paper windows that I made before. And I'm giving this building some extra height to make sure that it's offset both from the building that I made just before this one and the building that I'm gonna make on the corner. Just to have all sorts of different sizes and heights for all of the buildings on this string of facades, which I believe is the biggest string of facades in this entire section of the park. Now, aside from that little quirk of the heights and the base, this building is the same as the building on the right again, though the roof is also reversed on this one. Now the corner building is quite a bit different, a bit more similar to the corner building which I made earlier in this episode, but it also uses a slightly different color scheme. Not 100% sure yet how much I like it, but there were going to be like a lot of dark grey, brownish tones in many of the buildings so far, so I wanted to get a building which would look like it would be a little bit more new and a little bit lighter in color, and play with some different kind of window textures here. So that's in the end turned out to be a building which I am not actually sure what kind of shop that is. Yeah, I actually have no idea. But you could actually see me placing the roofs for many places, for many times during these videos on all of the buildings that I make, which isn't the fastest thing, but I always think that the best way to kind of tell what a building is going to look like, especially compared to what's around it, is to just quickly build the roof, because it really gives away the general shape of the building and how large it's going to be. It's almost kind of like a mass study to see yeah, what the building is going to look like finally shape-wise, and that's why I place a lot of these roofs and remove them later on, because to be very honest, I don't really like having the roofs in there, because yeah, if you have the roofs in there, you can't really look at what's underneath them or behind them. So they are kind of annoying. I just kind of place them to get an idea of what the shape of the building is going to be, then remove them, then build the rest of the building without any roofs blocking my view, and finally put in the roofs and all sorts of accents and details that you can get into it in the end. That's how I usually like to do things. It might not be the very fastest way, but it is usually a good way to know exactly the way your building is going to look in the game, without having to build the complete building first. And I think in the end it might save you time over having to tweak the shape of a building afterwards, because nothing is really worse than building a building first, doing all of the details and everything, and only at that point realizing that your roof should have been like one tile lower or moved to the right a little bit less. So yeah, I always like to make sure that I have the shape before I actually get into all of the details. Now with all those buildings done, it's time to spruce up the Jesus. Yeah, it's time to add some extra decoration by adding all of the foliage in, where pretty much, since this is quite a dense area with lots of buildings and paths, I did want to spruce it up quite densely and add many trees around there, wherever I could, to at least still keep quite a foresty look, even though it is such a dense area. Now Hero was planning ahead a little bit, though you'll see more of this area in the next video. There will be a temple and a Ferris wheel around here. It's kind of going to be like a very small sort of Japanese boulevard, except the Italian boulevard was pretty much next to a large lake with a log flume and a pretty good view, and this is just next to a small creek, but I figured it would fit in quite nicely and have some good interaction with the coaster, and also be a pretty good base to add some extra decoration around it, so that's why I ended up going for that. And just to get rid of that sort of legacy look of the Enterprise with all of the legacy fences and posts, I wanted to cover that up a little bit as well. I'm actually, like, one of the things that I am so happy about in Alpha 3, because this is actually the first Alpha 3 video, is the fact that when you place a fence, it just instantly replaces whatever fence was on its place. So in the past, if you'd build a fence over an already existing automatically placed fence of an attraction or of a raised path, you'd have double fences, but fences actually replace each other now, which is a really cool feature and quite handy if you wanna, customize things to whatever theme or look you're going for. Now at the back of this, I want to have some foliage because this is also going to be another transition area into what is most likely going to actually end up being a western area. I don't want to talk about it too much because it is quite far into the future, but in real life I have to start work on that area quite soon. And I hope to actually start work on a western area. Should hopefully fit in quite nice with the sort of geographical theme of this park, with having a Roman, an Alpine and a Japanese section. So that's something you'll see in the future, and I at least want to make sure that it could connect from the Japanese area and the Alpine area in some ways, so there was a bit of preparation for that. And the rest of this is pretty much the path elements, which I always end up doing last, but not very least, because it does have quite a big influence on how the area looks. And yeah, I really needed to actually add some path elements, some benches, some lights and litter bins to decorate this, make it look a little bit more alive and less empty. So there's just a lot of placing lamps and benches and litter bins here, with no exact kind of planning or idea, other than it just has to look good. That's pretty much everything I went for here. Anyway, that's it for this video, so thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time, in which I'll take you on a trip to build a Japanese temple and a Ferris wheel and do all sorts of decorations across the entire park that were added in Alpha 3 and in Alpha 2 as well, actually. So hope to see you guys then.